Okay, so I'm going to start a regular loaf, just one. I'm going to start with 300 grams of water, room temperature. A little much. Just pour some in my cup for me. .301, that'll do. I'm gonna tear and add about 10 grams of salt. I'm just using a fork to whisk it together, just enough. I've got my starter straight out of the fridge. I fed it last Saturday, but it's still usable. I use all but just a small layer on the bottom, which I believe ends up being like 20 or 30 grams. But I'm adding, let's see what it looks like. It's about 120 grams today. And I'm just leaving this much. We'll deal with that later. Set it to the side. We'll whisk that all together. Okay, so now I'm going to tear my scale and add my flours. I'm going to start with equal parts whole grain or whole wheat flour and rye flour, up to 150 grams total. I think after that it ends up being more dense than you would like it. So we do about 75 grams of rye. $73. I'm not going to tear it, and I'm going to go to 150 with the whole wheat. Doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of close. And then I'm not going to tear it, and I'm going to go to 450 with your bread flour or all-purpose. I'm just using bread flour because that's what I have. Close enough. All right. So now I'm just going to take my fork and stir it together as best I can, but it doesn't have to be perfect right now. This is just going to be set aside for probably about 30 minutes to an hour, just to let the flours hydrate, which is called autolyse. And it's not coming together super well, but that's okay. Just leaving it as a shaggy dough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover it with a lid or with a cloth, and I'll come back to it in a little while. Go ahead and feed my starter for next week. I'm going to just tear out a container. You don't have to change containers unless it's really dirty or if you want to. Just to see how much is actually in here for your information. Oh, it's more than I thought. It's about 50 grams. 53. But I'm going to tear it out and I'm going to add, let's do about 55 grams of water. And I usually start with the water just because I want to add the same amount of water. But if I add too much now or too little now, I just want to know what that number is because it's easier to take out flour than it is water. All right, 58. We'll work with that. So I'm going to tare that and add probably like 15 to 20 grams of rye flour. You don't have to do a whole grain. I've just read that it's kind of like extra nutrition for your yeast. Plus I bought a bunch of rye flour in bulk, so now I have no choice but to use it. So let's add a little more. All right, 17 grams. And now I'm going to just keep going with my bread flour. You can use all purpose up to 58. So you have the same amount as you do water. There is no real ratio that I use. You just want at least as much flour as you did starter. Because if you have like say 30 grams of starter and 50 grams of starter, 30 grams of flour, it's gonna burn through it so fast, you're not gonna be able to like successfully use it. It's just gonna eat it up very quickly. I did end up using a little bit more flour than water, but that's okay. I just want to scrape the sides down the best I can, scrape the bottom, so it's all mixed. And then I'm just gonna pat it down a little bit so I can see where we started. All right, good enough. I'll save the spatula with my dough for later. But I'm just gonna set my rubber band to the starting point and set it aside. And when it doubles in size, we're ready to shape our dough. Okay, so now I'm going to knead the dough. I'm just gonna kind of start by just combining everything. Might take a minute. Just turning the bowl and kind of turning it over on itself. And you can kind of use it to wipe the sides down if you need to. It's a little bit sticky, but not anywhere near as bad as something with a higher hydration. And I just keep doing this until, I don't know, the ball looks smooth. People say to try the window pane test where you stretch it out really thin, and if you can see light through it and it doesn't break, your gluten structure is good enough. Don't know if that will work with mine just because of how much whole wheat flour is in there, but we'll try it. Try that window pane test. I don't know if it'll work. I'm just gonna take a small amount of dough and kind of stretch it super thin. I don't know if you can tell, but it ripped. That didn't work. but I know it's okay. Just as long as it's mostly together and you can kind of see the strands of dough, like when you pull it, you can see kind of like straight lines. Those are the gluten structures forming. Okay, I'll say that's probably good enough because we're gonna still do a bunch of stretch and folds. So just put the dough back that's on your hands, and I'm gonna leave it for about 15 minutes to rest, and then we'll do some folds. All right, so we're gonna start our first set of stretch and folds. My poor little sink is out of commission, so I have a bowl of water so you can use a wet hand to turn it so it doesn't stick to you. So you're just gonna take this one side of it, stretch it up kind of far, but not so it breaks, and turn it over on itself, and turn the bowl. If your hands dry out or it starts to stick to you, just get more water. And you just do that all the way around the bowl. This one's kind of a stiff dough, so it's not gonna cooperate that well, but just do the best you can. All right. So I'm gonna do that 2 more times, letting it rest 15 minutes in between. You can get away with just 1 more time, but 2 more is ideal, 3 total. Okay, it's been about 12 hours. My starter is at peak, it's doubled already. And I did put a bit of the dough in a jar. I started at this line. It has only risen about 50% its volume, not doubled. So it's definitely ready to shape. I've got a loaf pan. I don't have a banneton, so I do this instead. A tea towel that I'm going to sprinkle with some rice flour. Not a whole lot, just enough to make it not stick. Set that to the side. I'm gonna flour my surface a little bit. And I'm just gonna dump my dough out on the surface. Let's try that poke test. It leaves a little bit of an indent, but it looks like it's springing back slowly. But I think the jar method with a bit of the dough in it is probably your best bet. The dough doesn't smell sour, it kind of smells sweet. And I'm gonna do a little layer of flour on the top just so it doesn't stick to me. And if I need to add more, I can add more. So I'm just gonna stretch it out best I can into sort of a rectangle. And I'm gonna fold it in half. I've got some extra flour and I'm just gonna brush it off a little bit. And then I'm just gonna roll it up. And now I'm gonna just start dragging it to me to create tension all the way around the ball. I got a really big air bubble here, so I'm just gonna kind of pinch it to pop it. A few air bubbles are fine, but if you have a lot of really big ones, it's going to affect the internal structure later. All right, I'm just going to kind of pull it like this just to make more of a long oblong loaf. And I'm going to flip it and just put it in. And my seam's not really coming undone, so I'm not going to go ahead and sew it, but you can if you want to. And that's it. So now I'm just going to wrap it up a little bit, and I'm going to mist the top just a bit so that it doesn't dry out in the fridge. I'm going to mist just a little. Alright, I'll put a lid on and then put it in the fridge. I'll come back in probably about 8 hours and bake it. I did forget to add my extra little bit of bread. I'm going to add that now, just at the bottom. It'll be okay. I'm just going to kind of... It's the bottom, it'll be okay. But just go ahead and add that before you shape it, like when you're scooping it out on the table. That way you'll have a more consistent loaf. I would take it out, except I already have a bunch of rice flour and that'll affect the texture a bit. Yeah, that'll work. Okay, we just pulled our dough out of the fridge. It's been sitting for probably 9 or 10 hours in the fridge. I have my preheated Dutch oven. I'm going to turn out my dough onto my parchment paper. Straight out of the fridge. Just going to take this off. I'm going to add a little bit more rice flour just for decoration. And I'm going to score it with a razor blade. You can use a sharp knife. You can go horizontally, or sorry, vertically, horizontally. I'm going to go horizontally. I feel this way you get a higher, longer loaf, whereas if you score it this way, you get a wider, shorter loaf. At least from what I can see. Just gonna pick it up and put it into my preheated Dutch oven and mist it with some water. Put it in at 425 with the lid on for 30 minutes and then with the lid off for 15 minutes. Okay, we just pulled our dough out of the fridge. It's been sitting for probably 9 or 10 hours in the fridge. I have my preheated Dutch oven. I'm going to turn out my dough onto my parchment paper. Straight out of the fridge. Just going to take this off. I'm going to add a little bit more rice flour just for decoration. And I'm going to score it with a razor blade. You can use a sharp knife. You can go horizontally, or sorry, vertically, horizontally. I'm gonna go horizontally. I feel this way you get a higher, longer loaf, whereas if you score it this way, you get a wider, shorter loaf. At least from what I can see. Just gonna pick it up and put it into my preheated Dutch oven and mist it with some water. And put it in at 425 with the lid on for 30 minutes and then with the lid off for 15 minutes.